mean, I've long believed that the Human Rights Act, for example, needs to be abolished, and not only that the Human Rights Act itself should be abolished, but also that Britain should probably come out of the jurisdiction of the European Court on Human Rights. We could still have our own legal framework establishing some of these rights, and perhaps even have more rights that are consistent with our own legal traditions in that kind of framework. But I think that's a problem, and you can't spend 5 years working in the Home Office where you're trying to remove illegal immigrants and deport foreign criminals, and not be critical of the way human rights laws work.
Hiya and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. We're the channel that asks you to think more and follow less. On today's show, we've got Nick Timothy. Now, Nick is the son of a Birmingham steelworker that, in his book Remaking One Nation, combines both political theory and experience of daily politics to put forward some really interesting and timely proposals. Some I disagree with that we tease out in the interview, but some that I think are really timely and should be looked at carefully and seriously. He draws on his time in the book advising Theresa May at both the Home Office and in Number 10. I ask him about reforms to human rights legislation, Theresa May's failings, capitalism, and Hong Kong and the response to China. It's a great interview. Do let us know what you think in the comment section and give it a little share. Cheers. What do you think the mistakes were during Theresa May's time in Number 10, besides the obvious one of not winning an outright majority?
Well, I mean, you've got to break it down into the phases, haven't you? I mean, when I worked for Theresa, that was from the point at which she became Prime Minister through to the point at which we screwed up the election. And in that time, I think the Brexit agenda that was set out was actually something that I think most people who voted Leave recognised as Brexit. It was a clean break. It understood that Brexit had to mean leaving the EU's institutions and laws in full. That meant leaving the customs union and the single market. And the problem with that was, I think, because the Brexit divide cut through the electoral coalitions of the two parties, and it cut through and created divides within the parties in Westminster. It never felt like there was a likely majority in the Commons to deliver, I think, probably any kind of Brexit at that stage. And that was, I think, probably the main reason why we thought we needed the early election in 2017. And obviously, the election went badly wrong. I won't go into all the reasons as to why it went wrong. We added a net 2.5 million votes to the Conservative total. It was the highest share of the vote we'd achieved since '83, but the Labour vote surged enormously too, and we lost the majority. And then I think in the second phase of Theresa's leadership, whereas previously she'd been very clear about her intention to take Britain out of the laws and institutions of the EU in full, I think by that point her Remainer instincts and her sort of cautious political instincts and her view of the parliamentary arithmetic meant that she had to try to agree a much softer Brexit. And let's be honest, it was effective membership of the customs union, and it felt like she was likely to give away quite a lot more besides. So I think in that second phase, I think the thing that really went wrong was that she lost sight of what Brexit was, and she made some pretty bad decisions in terms of what the tactics ought to be in Parliament. It was always the case, I think, if you had at least one flank of the Tory party, the Brexiteers, saying this isn't really Brexit, it always gave an opportunity for Labour MPs representing Leave constituencies to say they didn't need to vote for it. So if she didn't take the Tory party with her, she was never going to take the Labour party with her.
Yeah. Feel free to tell me to bugger off with this next question, by the way, but I'm asking as a sort of, I think it's a really interesting dynamic and goes to the very heart of why people often describe politics as quite a cutthroat business. You obviously, in your Telegraph column, or plural actually, columns, used it as a platform in which to, I guess, come out against Theresa during the last few days of her time in office. Was that quite a difficult thing to do, because you'd obviously worked with the former Prime Minister and Home Secretary for quite a number of years? I can't remember how many off the top of my head. And was that difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously sort of on a personal level quite difficult when you go a different way to somebody you've worked for closely in the past. I spent 5 years with her in the Home Office, a year in Downing Street, and I'd worked with her at times in opposition too. I mean, I didn't just sort of abruptly, say it was time to go at the end. I mean, I think my pieces were broadly sympathetic and supportive of what she was doing for quite a while, and then I think it just became clear that she was taking a wrong turn on Brexit. And my view is if you're employed to write a column, to be a comment writer, you have to be absolutely honest with yourself, and you have to treat your readers with respect and tell them in an unvarnished way about the way you see the world. And as she started to take that wrong turn on Brexit, I did start to get more critical. And as we started to reach the end point, I did say that it was starting to do the party enormous damage, and it was time for her to step aside. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's it's a difficult thing to do on a personal level, but I think it's really important that when we're talking about these things, we're talking about on one level we're talking about political ideas, which I think you have to be intellectually honest about, but we're also talking about the future of the country, and this is really big, serious stuff, and it's more important than individual relationships and friendships.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Now, Nick, going back to your latest Telegraph column on the Conservative parties, if we focus again on your time in Number 10 and in the Home Office, battles with the public sector, quangos, and the so-called deep state that perpetuate a left-wing agenda you write about. Now, I've had my own run-ins with a couple of those, but I wonder how many times in your career you found yourself frustrated with these bodies.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to say is I think if you're working in the government, you should expect significant checks and balances. Nobody wants to live in a country with any kind of unchecked power in the hands of ministers, and sometimes those checks can be really annoying. And of course, when you're trying to design the kind of perfect constitutional system, or something as close to perfect as you're likely to get, then something that looks good on a piece of paper in practice might not be very. It might not be comfortable for the people in the system, but it might also actually get the balance wrong. And as times change, organisations' remits and purpose might not be quite right for new times. So that's my sort of cautious preface. But I think there is a problem with the British state. I mean, firstly, the government itself is too centralised. We need to do much more in terms of. I personally favour a federal system for the UK and an English Parliament. But I also favour a lot more devolution from the central state to councils and to mayors and so on. But there is also a problem with the role of quangos and their accountability. And I think in some cases, the quangos may not need to exist. We may be able to structure things in different ways. But of course, there is a case for having these bodies, and you will need them in lots of different ways. And I think sometimes Conservatives worry too much about the people in these positions, and they worry that they tend to be full of left wingers or sort of cultural liberals who are pursuing their own political agenda, regardless of whether there's a Conservative or a Labour government in place nationally. And I think sometimes that may be the case, but I think there's actually probably a more fundamental problem, which is those organisations are operating within sort of macro legal frameworks that were designed by the Labour Party, and which Conservatives haven't really had the strength of desire to reform. And by those legal frameworks, I mean things like the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act. In the past, we've also had European law too. And I think if Conservatives want public bodies to have some kind of correction, to be less politically correct, less likely to pursue sort of left-wing or culturally liberal policies against the wishes of ministers, then they're going to need to do something about those frameworks as much as they need to do something about the individuals that run these bodies.
Is this something you recognised only after leaving Number 10? And if not, why was it not higher up on your agenda for tackling it whilst you were there?
I mean, I've been a supporter of some of these changes for quite some time. I've long believed that the Human Rights Act, for example, needs to be abolished, and not only that the Human Rights Act itself should be abolished, but also that Britain should probably come out of the jurisdiction of the European Court on Human Rights. Mm-hmm. We could still have our own legal framework establishing some of these rights, and perhaps even have more rights that are consistent with our own legal traditions in that kind of framework. But I think that's a problem, and you can't spend 5 years working in the Home Office where you're trying to remove illegal immigrants and deport foreign criminals, and not be critical of the way human rights laws work. I think I've probably come to realise that and I think I probably think this more as more of these kind of woke tendencies in certain public bodies reveal themselves. I've probably become more convinced that actually there's an equivalent argument to be made about the Equality Act. If you impose a public sector equality duty on every public entity in the country, if you expect them to complete equality impact assessments on practically any decision or change they make, then you're creating, especially in bureaucracies that quite often sort of overdo and gold plate legal requirements, you're creating a culture where this kind of thing is more likely. So I think I've been a long-standing critic of the Human Rights Act and the ECHR. I think I've probably come to a similar view about the Equality Act, but more recently.
After nearly 2 decades of Islamist terror and violence, why do we not seem to be any further forward as far as action's concerned? Why do we not yet know or appear to know what needs to be done?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that nothing has been done. I mean, we're dealing with a problem that is actually entrenched and relates to an ideology that is shared by people across all sorts of countries, across Muslim majority countries, but also across populations in Western countries. And so the truth is, there's not going to be a single solution that just means that we can escape this danger. And the other thing to say is the danger we face is always changing. The nature of radicalization of young people is changing. It's much more sophisticated now. It's much more online. It's actually less likely to happen these days in mosques or other local institutions. The nature of attacks is changing. It's less likely to be the sort of big spectaculars that Al Qaeda used to attempt. The attacks we're seeing much more now are likely to be knife attacks or even using things like trucks to drive into crowds, and those are much harder for the authorities to keep up to date with. And the authorities, as we're reminded each time there's an attack, have thousands of people on their databases, and they have to manage risk all the time in terms of working out who they should be worrying most about. And the state is engaged in a constant battle, I think, in terms of making sure that legal powers are up to date, making sure that that the authorities have the right kind of systems, the right kind of know-how, and so on. But there's a broader point that we need to confront, which is about the ideology and the nature of the radicalization. It's not just about the practicalities of going after the people who want to commit these acts of violence. It's also about making sure that we don't have this hateful ideology in our society that makes it more likely that people will succumb to violent organizations. And that I think is a hard long-term thing. And I think as a country we've probably got better at demonstrating our intolerance of certain behaviour when it comes to blocking hate preachers from coming into the country, banning certain organisations, disrupting certain kinds of activities that provide opportunities for radicalisation. But there's plenty more we can do still.
What do you think can be done about the English Channel crisis? Because I think I was reading your column last night on this. I can't remember when it must have been from, actually, because there seems to be every single year a new crisis at the English Channel where so-called liberals, I would argue it's not a liberal approach at all, encourage migrants almost to undertake really dangerous makeshift journeys in makeshift boats. Now, what good does it do to encourage people traffickers and all the like to convince people that they'll be able to get to the other side and that good old Blighty will look after them? I wonder, does this go back to your earlier point about the fact that it's human rights reforms that need to be put in place here?
Well, I think this is actually probably a slightly different thing, although it does touch on human rights culture, and the legal situation is likely to change when we come out of the European Union. But the EU has a rule called the Dublin Regulation, which means that if you get to the European Union and you enter the European Union via one country, and then you get to another country and you try to claim asylum there, you are supposed to be returned to the country that you originally reached first.
Yeah.
And that is where you're supposed to claim asylum. And I think Britain has been not especially strong in using that regulation, and we enter into periodic negotiations with the French about whether we take some different migrants who are gathered at the camp at Sangatte, and I think we don't yet know what system is likely to emerge beyond Brexit, because these things will need to be negotiated. Mm-hmm. The Dublin Regulation may end up continuing in some form. But we ought to be much more robust about enforcing things like that. In the end, I think the West is going to have to take a slightly different view of the way we accept refugees. I think if you look at the profile of people who come to Western countries as refugees, they are disproportionately young, male, and fit and strong. We're not actually helping the most vulnerable people in countries that are affected by war or by political oppression. And we're also encouraging people to undertake very dangerous journeys, often at the hands of people traffickers and international criminal gangs. So I think in the end, if we want to address this problem, frankly, it may be simpler for people in positions of power to just pretend the problem isn't there. But if we do want to address this problem, I think there will be a case for saying that countries should set up systems for trying to take some of the most vulnerable people from affected places to bring them to Britain, which actually is what the government did in Syria.
Yeah.
And then we should say that people who want to claim asylum actually in the West will be processed offshore to discourage bogus applications and to discourage these dangerous journeys that people undertake at the hands of these horrible trafficking gangs. Actually, the European Union talked about doing that a couple of years ago when the migration crisis was raging, but they haven't really got anywhere since.
Cameron used to speak about a British Bill of Rights and all of those sorts of proposals, but you don't really hear that anymore. Do you think that sort of...
Well, David used to talk about the British Bill of Rights as a replacement for the Human Rights Act without leaving the convention.
Right, yes. But didn't Theresa also want to stay in the convention?
Well, she expressed a view at one or 2 points, I think, that we should leave the convention. But she was never in a position politically to deliver on that, so never tried. But as I say, my view is that we should leave the convention, and I think the Human Rights Act is problematic, but changing the Human Rights Act without leaving the convention will not address the problem at heart.
Okay, yeah. Now, if we move on to talk about economics, that fun old topic, you speak about failed liberal economics and an economic system that's basically failed non-elite Britain. But what's the solution? That's what I want to explore now, because the tax burden has never been higher. Deficit, or at least for over 50 odd years, deficit reduction has gone out of the window. Don't get me started on debt, it makes me want to cry. Even before COVID-19, that includes deficit reduction and the debt burden there. Regulations have never been more burdensome. GDPR and other online harms regulations that are coming down the track as well. You've got heavy intervention in the energy market, with government trying to pick winners and putting up prices for the poorest consumers in Britain. And I want to know what exactly, after everything that I've just listed, what are the excesses of free market economics, when I would argue there hasn't been much in the way of free market economics in quite some time.
The point about British economic policy for some time has been that there's been a lot of scepticism about intervening in markets, even where those markets are failing. And one example you could pick at random is the way in which the markets defined by sort of new technologies are not really subject to proper regulatory systems and frameworks right now. But there's also been a sort of broadly non-interventionist attitude to the fact that we have just a terribly unbalanced regional economy, where we have London in the southeast, which is incredibly prosperous, and then we have the regions which have been lagging behind for some time in pretty much every economic measure in terms of productivity, growth, wages, and so on. And I think people in those parts of the country have been waiting for the invisible hand of the market to turn up and to restore economic growth in the way that the theorists would say it will. but maybe it hasn't turned up and it's still invisible because it doesn't exist. And I think if you really want proper regional growth now, we're going to need proper industrial strategy where the state will go much further in terms of making sure that there's right infrastructure investment, the right public investment in research and development, the right incentives, the right governance right across the country, which is not something we've had for some time.
If we take the energy market rather for one example, though, I think that's one case where a genuine free market probably would provide better outcomes for consumers. One, in green technologies, if there is genuinely a market for these supposedly renewable technologies.
Well, I mean, there are probably plenty of areas that one could highlight where the state is intervening ineffectively. But I mean, my broader point is that there is no strategic effort brought to bear in terms of creating the frameworks and getting the conditions right for regional growth. I mean, the point about energy is something that actually can't be left to a free market. I mean, firstly, there's the case of energy security, and any government needs to make sure that that basically we have the capacity to keep the lights on. So there's the security element, and then there's the climate element, where I've been critical actually of some of the things that the government has done on climate policy, where I think we've been unnecessarily unilateralist and earlier movers than other countries, which has led to the loss of some manufacturing capacity in Britain. Yeah. But if you want our economy and our country to move towards towards cleaner energy types, then actually you need to create frameworks that make sure that pricing is set in a way that takes into account all the externalities that energy involves, and from a climate perspective, you need to take into account the externalities of carbon emissions as well as other factors like the security of supply.
Mm. Now, I wonder then, as far as making things a genuine devolution agenda is concerned, as one way of really boosting the regions and actually devolved administrations in the UK, and giving people, I think, one key point I always go back to is giving people genuine purchase over their lives and their society and their communities. I think that can be done, though, without the state trying to plan and pick winners. I think you do that by devolving things like corporation tax, for example, have genuine competition between the regions. I don't think that's a race to the bottom, as some have suggested. A good example for that, I think, would be if we look at Northern Ireland at the minute. The Republic of Ireland has had to bring the Green Party in to government in order to function because Sinn Féin did so well at the last election. And this is the ideal opportunity for Northern Ireland to be quite competitive when it comes to the Republic. And if they had these devolved powers further than they have right now, I think that could be really, really good for them, as just one example.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things to say there. I mean, firstly, as I said earlier, I'm a supporter of a federal UK and more powers being devolved to counties and mayoralties, and I think one of the important things you need to do there is to make sure that genuine responsibility for political decision making is aligned with accountability. And one of the problems with the devolved model at the moment is actually those things are not aligned, which means whether it's Sadiq Khan as the mayor of London or whether it's Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, they're always able to point the finger at Westminster and to say it's the fault of the national government. And if we want if we want actually political efficiency, but if we also want sort of democratic fairness, then you need that responsibility and accountability to be aligned. And I would say that that should include some changes when it comes to the ways in which taxes are raised. On the point about corporation tax, Britain has a highly competitive corporation tax rate at the moment. There is now, I think, a question about, do you go any further in making new reductions in corporation tax? And my judgment is that if you reduce it any further from where we are now, you actually get relatively little bang for your buck as you make those reductions, and that there are probably other business tax cuts and tax changes that could do more, especially for regional rebalancing, like capital allowances and R&D tax credits.
Yeah. I mean, okay, I wonder then to what extent you think that by arguing that the market has failed and market orthodoxy has failed and all of these things, are you worried that because capitalism has taken quite the battering over recent years, really, are you worried that you're doing the left's job for them?
No, I mean, I think it's important to make sure that capitalism is reformed and regulated in a way that means it can be protected from people who are anti-capitalist. I'm very much in favour of open markets and capitalism. The question is, what kind of capitalist system do you want to see? How fair is it for workers and consumers? How productive and innovative is it? And how competitive is it likely to make the British economy overall?
Yeah, I mean, so I've got two more questions. I think my generation are pretty awful when it comes to being snowflakey, and I actually think many of those who argue that once they get through the university system, start to pay taxation rather, and have to enter the real world, as it were, they'll suddenly realise, you know, they're conservative in value and everything else. I don't think that is the case. I imagine this generation are going to be pretty left-wing throughout their lives, most of them. But I do think, though, there is a pretty robust argument that many people, if you look at the stats, many people in England now own their own home outright over paying a mortgage. And how can the Tories, or those who are pro-capitalism in general, appeal to younger voters whilst they support some people who support NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard for those who don't know, whilst they also keep the triple lock on pensions, which I know was I think it was in the 2017 manifesto to scrap that, and all of these things in place, which seem to me genuine intergenerational inequalities.
Yeah, we definitely have to be very conscious about intergenerational fairness. I mean, to me, it's not a surprise that people become more skeptical about capitalism when they don't have any capital. And I think history has shown that people are more likely to become conservative, at least with a small c, but normally with a big C too, when they get their first job, when they get married, when they have children, and when they own their own home. And if those things all happen later in life, then it's less surprising that many people will only become more conservative at a later age than has been normal before. And we need to do much more in terms of house building, changing the way that the financialization of housing has worked. We need to do much more to give younger people more opportunities, not just the 50% who go to university, but the 50% who are completely disregarded at the moment. But so we should be giving them proper technical education, vocational education. Some of those who currently go to university might actually be better suited anyway to more applied study. We need to give much more opportunities like those, and yes, that will mean in some cases taking on. You talked about NIMBYism there's another acronym which sums up extreme NIMBYism, which is called BANANAS, which stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And we do need to take on some of those attitudes, and that will mean reforming the planning system.
Yeah. Right, to end then, I'm going to ask a question that you can really sink your teeth into. At least I think you will be able to. Your column is full of these sorts of articles, actually, which is very good. I'm glad that you are leading the charge on this, because I think you're an incredibly thoughtful person, and if only there were more like you in the House of Commons. But have you been quite heartened by the response to Hong Kong, the UK's response to Hong Kong, as far as visa offers and the refusal, I think, to kowtow to China, which I think the European Union's response on this, and I know a lot of people watching this will be saying, well, you would say that, Darren, wouldn't you? But I think the European Union's response on this has been pretty abysmal. But our connections to that former colony might feel pretty far removed to some people, but I do think we've got a moral obligation there to protect these people who must be feeling pretty desperate at the minute. So that's the first part of that question, Nick. But the second part would be, what would you like to see going forward as the UK's response to that? How do we diversify enough to ensure that we're not so heavily reliant upon China?
Well, there's two specific things, I think. I mean, firstly, there's the question of Hong Kong itself, and then there's the relationship with China overall. I mean, on Hong Kong, we're in a unique position in the world as the former colonial power, but also as the treaty signatory with China, where that treaty guaranteed the one country, two systems model, which China is, quite frankly, just tearing up now with the passage of its security law and what is likely to come thereafter. So I think we have an important role there. Partly that is about making representations in international institutions like the United Nations. The treaty was lodged with the United Nations. It's about trying to corral likely allied countries in those institutions, but also in terms of policy responses. And actually, I think Britain's done a good job in that respect when it comes to the visa offer that Boris has made to British nationals overseas in Hong Kong. And I think it would be good if that could be coordinated with other like-minded countries, whether that's the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, even Taiwan, which has made an offer to Hong Kong nationals. But then there's the question of China itself. I've been a China skeptic for a very long time. I worked in the Home Office engaging with the intelligence agencies between 2010 and 2015. It was apparent as far back as that the Chinese were abusing the international trading system. They were engaging in industrial scale, industrial espionage. They were making all sorts of threats to companies that were operating in China. They were setting up debt traps for countries where they would build infrastructure, and then when countries couldn't afford to make the repayments, they would introduce new conditions to their contracts about things like military access to ports and things like that. It's quite clear what they're doing with the telecommunications infrastructure in general, and the role of Huawei and making themselves a central part of Western systems. And they've been buying their way into British critical national infrastructure for nearly 10 years now. So I think the behaviour of China before and after the outbreak of COVID-19 marks an opportunity to correct those policies as the world starts to realise just how dangerous the Chinese regime is. I mean, firstly, there was the recklessness that led to the outbreak of the virus. There was the refusal to engage with the WHO and the failure to share information about the virus early on. But there's also been its policies under the cloak of the world's attention being on the pandemic. So there's a border dispute with India, which has led to deaths of Indian soldiers. They're flying military jets into Taiwanese airspace, even locking onto Taiwanese aircraft, but not shooting them down. They've sunk a Vietnamese fishing vessel. They've been expanding their military facilities in the South China Sea, and they've effectively torn up the treaty with Britain for Hong Kong, and they're also going around the world spreading all sorts of misinformation about the origins of the virus, claiming sometimes it started in Italy and sometimes in the United States. This all gives, I think, the democracies the moment to correct our policies towards China, and there is plenty we can do to protect ourselves, whether that's by building more resilience and state capacity on a sort of country by country level when it comes to things like protecting ourselves from accidental threats like the virus has been, but also from deliberate threats like cyber attack. We can try to encourage changes in the way that international supply chains work so that they are less exposed to China and more resilient and perhaps even a little shorter. It might give an opportunity to bring some production and some jobs home. That's what the Japanese government is doing right now. We should be building international alliances, creating new institutions, bringing some of the rising powers into the existing institutions, decision-making structures, where we can create bigger coalitions, including certain regional partners in the sort of Pacific region, to constrain China's actions. There's all sorts of things we can be doing. It's a shame it's taken us this long to start thinking about them, but it's better late than never, and we need to get on with it now.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I doubt we're alone in that either, because it does seem to me that the West has been asleep at the wheel on all of this that you've just so eloquently set out. And I tell you what, I hope you do consider standing for Parliament again, because you would be a fantastic voice in there. You really would.
Well, we'll see about that.
Absolutely. Well, cheers, Nick.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's nice talking to you.
Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that relies on support from people like yourself who want us to continue producing our free-thinking, high-quality content. You can rest assured whatever you donate, big or small, will be put back into ensuring we win the battle of ideas. Thank you for your support.